Brilliant. Okay, hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this event hosted by Policy at Manchester, which is University of Manchester's Policy Engagement Unit. My name is Maddy Thimont-Jack. I am an Associate Director at the Institute for Government, and I lead our Brexit programme. And yes, we do still have a Brexit programme for the time being. I just say at the start, I think for housekeeping reasons, to say that we are not expecting a fire alarm to go off. So if it does go off, I think someone from the team will direct us and tell us where we need to go. But thank you very much for those in the room who are here, but also for those who are watching on the live stream. This is a discussion about how to champion the voice of British business in trade. As I think many of us know, striking new trade deals has been a central part of the UK government's sort of strategy for global Britain. So far, the Department for International Trade has rolled over most of the trade deals the UK was party to as a member of the EU. They've also got an agreement in principle reached with Australia and hoping one will soon be reached with New Zealand. The UK has also applied to join CPTPP. Don't quite ask me what that stands for. I haven't made a note of it just in case someone does. But it's not just about numbers. It's also the trade and investment agreements are about boosting the UK's economy and also helping businesses to grow. So I am delighted to have such a great panel with me here to discuss how the government should be doing that. Just so that you all know, I'm going to introduce members of the panel, and then each of them will be speaking for between 3 and 5 minutes to sort of share some opening remarks. I will then ask some follow-up questions, and then there'll be plenty of time for you to submit questions as well. And again, anyone watching the live stream, if you send in questions, I think someone in the room will be able to ask them on your behalf. So please do think about what you want to ask them all. So if I just give some short introductions, I'm joined by Southworth, Secretary-General at the International Chamber of Commerce and Director of the Secretariat for the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Trade and Export Promotion. And I think there is a sort of longer bio as well out there. I wasn't going to read it all out, I should say. I'm also joined by Susana, Córdoba, Head of International Trade at Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce. To my left is Dr. Jasem Tarawneh. Oh, I said I was going to butcher that. He's lecturer in commercial intellectual property law at the University of Manchester and is a legal academic associate at King's Chamber. And last but by no means least, I'm joined by Ahmed, partner at Deloitte in Manchester, co-leader of the Deloitte India Services Group and deputy chair of the Manchester-India Partnership and honorary consul of Japan in Manchester. So without further ado, I will hand over to Chris first to share his thoughts.
Well, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to kind of come and talk to you today. I thought what I'd start with is just a bit of context in which the UK is in, much of which you'll know, but I think it's always useful to keep reminding ourselves that we're not in this sort of disruptive environment on our own. Globally, there's just enormous disruption across global value chains. That disruption has been going on for a long time before COVID arrived. And that's been driven by a number of different things: technology, advancement, demographies, rising populations and middle classes, particularly in the East. Consumer power, purchasing power is growing. And then we've also been in this period of growing populism and nationalism globally, governments turning inward in focus, looking at the electorates, power blocks emerging, so trade blocks getting more muscular in the language of the EU, particularly China, EU and US. And around all of that, an enormous backlash against trade, much of which isn't actually about trade, it's about things like technology, but a real frustration that people feel they haven't felt the benefits of trade, particularly in the developed countries like the UK, because much of the poverty reduction has really happened in the developing countries and hasn't really necessarily been felt here. So there's enormous pressure there in the system, and the system is under enormous strain. And then on top of all of that, businesses are dealing with an incredible array of complex costs escalating in all directions, whether it's cybersecurity or red tape, border complexity, shipping, and the complexity of these, free trade agreements escalating everywhere. And the more free trade agreements you have at bilateral level, the more cost and complexity you get in the system, which is why we're always arguing for multilateral agreements. One set of rules for everybody is always the best option. And then in the UK, the context, of course, is post-Brexit. We're finding our feet as a new independent nation. It sounds a bit weird and new, because we're not new at all, but we are relearning trade as an independent policy country. We've done the rollovers, so we've sort of undertaken phase one of post-Brexit. Don't forget that when we left the EU, that was the starting line. That wasn't sort of phase two, that's phase one. And then we're now sort of looking ahead as to what's our role in the world, what does global Britain mean, what sort of foreign relations policy do we have, what's our strategy for all of that, and all of that is really to be clarified. And then in terms of global industry priorities, it's pretty straightforward. We've got to tackle COVID. We're vaccinated, but much of the world is not. If you look at places like Africa, they're 2 to 3% vaccinated. We can't grow the global economy or trade with other countries until we're all vaccinated. So number one priority is we've got to get everyone vaccinated. It's in everyone's interest to do that. Climate and net zero, the ESG agenda for industry is absolute boardroom priority number one. I don't know any boardroom that's not talking about that as the priority. How do we make that big transition? It's got huge implications for global value chains. Inequalities, we know they've grown. We know industry's got a big role to play in terms of kind of minimizing those inequalities. In the UK, that's the levelling up agenda. In other parts of the world, it's called by a different name. But we've got, growing inequalities that we need to get under the skin of that and tackle it. And then we've got these enormous opportunities to completely transform the digital trade ecosystem and really create a modern trading environment. For those that don't know much about trade, it's pretty technical and horrible. For those that do it day in, day out, and incredibly antiquated. We're operating on laws going back to 1882. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out that that's a little bit out of date. We need to update the legal frameworks, modernize the system, but that's an enormous opportunity. And I'm pleased to say the UK is right at the vanguard of that globally. So the UK government has done some fantastic work at G7 to drive that work. So what do we need to think about going forward? Balanced foreign trade policy. We're in a position where we're on our own. We're operating in a world where blocks of countries are operating stronger and tighter than they've ever worked, and that will be the future trend. Do we have the right foreign trade policy? We would argue that we need balanced relations with particularly the big blocks, China, the US, and the EU. We're not in a position to pick one side or the other. And I would look to places like Singapore who navigate that difficult territory very well and be very pragmatic. That's what we're famous for out there in the world, is pragmatism, common sense, being a free trade champion. That's what we should be aiming for. And there is an important role for countries like the UK to partner up with other countries like Singapore, Australia, Japan, to help bridge the dialogue between these big power blocks who are finding it very difficult to come to consensus agreements on, tricky issues like data, well, if I can say militarization. We can see it in the newspapers where the difficulties are. There's a really important role right now for what I would call the mid-tier economies, which we are one, to help bridge that dialogue. We've done that historically. That's been our historical role over many centuries. It's not new to us, but we do need to relearn it and get back to that type of operation and then grab the opportunities like digital trade. Look at what's in front of us, try and focus on what businesses are dealing with every day and try and help solve those problems for the longer term so that we get ourselves into a better place in order to trade well and successfully in the future. Thanks,
Chris. I think you've raised quite a few issues that we could definitely dig into in the course of the hour. So thanks. And you've also set a really nice parameter for what we're looking at today. So thank you. I'm going to come to Jo next to share your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maddy, and good afternoon, everyone. This discussion today is of particular interest to me, both through my work at Deloitte, where I help businesses with their international expansion plans, but really in terms of the insights and experience that I've gained through work on the Manchester-India Partnership and the Greater Manchester-Japan Steering Group. So let me tell you a little bit about the Manchester-India Partnership. The Manchester-India Partnership was launched in February 2018 in the House of Lords with the overarching aim to drive greater trade, investment, cultural and educational links between Greater Manchester and Japan, bringing together public and private sector bodies to do that. And to date, that partnership has achieved significant success, creating enhanced trade and investment flows, with the value of trade between the northwestern India hitting £1 billion in 2019, and creating over 3 years an additional 792 jobs. The reason the Manchester-India Partnership has worked is that Manchester has focused on a clear strategy and has focused on city-to-city diplomacy. spotting those areas of mutual collaboration and helping businesses match those opportunities to their specialist skills. Recently, we've seen other regions follow suit. There's been the launch of the West Midlands India Partnership recently, which to me further demonstrates that whatever national policies are rolled out, whatever deals are agreed, all of this has to be implemented at a local level. Many of you may know that the UK and India recently agreed an enhanced trade partnership with a roadmap to a full FTA by 2030. The Manchester-India Partnership helped coordinate the views of local businesses to feed into a consultation on what businesses want and what they need from a future FTA. And that's where I believe it continues to be vitally important that we listen to the views of business and represent their views in consultation, not just at a national level, but at that regional level. Chris mentioned levelling up. We know that's much talked about. And if we're serious about levelling up, FTAs have to look at the needs of the whole of the UK and particularly meet the needs of the regions as far as possible. Whilst I feel that there is that mechanism for the voice of business to be heard through those consultations into FTA dialogues, frequently what I hear from business is that they don't understand how to use or benefit from an FTA once it's agreed. So to my mind, there is a barrier effectively to the best use of FTAs. And really we need to look at what can be done at a practical level to, one, explain what an FTA means for certain industries, two, what specific opportunities exist, and three, how do businesses actually get started? The other point that I would like to make is that often FTAs, although they're described as trade and investment, they very heavily focus on trade and less on the investment side, which arguably I think can deliver even greater economic value. This year alone, there have been $343 billion worth of M&A deals, which is double that of 2019 and the highest since 2000. Data published in 2018 showed that whilst only 4% of businesses at that time operating in the UK were foreign owned, they accounted for nearly 5 million jobs and between 12% and 21% of local employment across all 12 regions of the UK. So inward investment is vital. It can boost not only jobs, but economic resilience. And we mentioned a moment ago by Chris, the supply chains and the diversity of supply chains we see as increasingly critical. So my hope is that whatever future FTAs are agreed, they fairly balance trade and investment, and most importantly, that the implementation of those agreements focus on how we can maximise the benefits.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. No, I think that's really interesting. I think particularly your discussion about the sort of how trade feeds into the levelling up agenda that the government obviously is so focused on at the moment, I think is something that we can definitely talk about. I'd be interested to sort of delve into that a bit more with the panel. If I can turn next to Susana to share your thoughts.
Yes, hi, thank you. No, I think I agree with what Chris and Jo have said. And I think for us, from a chamber point of view, and to give you a bit of background about us, we are the largest accredited chamber of commerce in the UK. So we represent about 4,200 members, and that roughly is 460,000 employees across the Greater Manchester region and beyond that. So we do have members across the UK and also from overseas. So for us, the free trade agreements have been obviously on the top of the list, list, especially in the framework of the EU and UK trade agreement. And it's all well and good. So how are we supporting companies? And I think Jo just mentioned the nail. It's basically companies, we all are relearning trade, as Chris also said. There is a huge lack of understanding of what the rules of origin are. We keep saying it's free trade agreement, and companies keep saying, oh yeah, but I'm sending my goods. It should be just going without any tariffs. Why am I being charged? Yeah, it's free trade if you understand rules of origin and how they apply to your products. And I cannot tell you how many companies were in complete shock when they were sending their goods to the EU after the 1st of January and understanding like, oh blimey, this is not as easy as it was supposed to be. So huge lack of understanding. And for us as a chamber has been a huge challenge to educate our members and customers on the practicalities of trading. from the basics of rules of origin, what cumulation means, which I think that's another huge point, that when we are advertising, oh, we signed a new trade agreement, that doesn't come up too much on the conversations. About the paperwork, nobody really understands, oh, is it a self-certification invoice or is it a certificate of origin? Companies are really, really struggling to understand with that. And with the actual way some of the customs authorities have been interpreting those rules. So for us, that's been a huge part of what we've been doing, but also trying to get understanding of how companies need the support and how they feel about trade at the moment. So we run quarterly economic survey, and that's a sentiment survey with traders and companies in general about how they feel about the current economy, how they feel about the future. And obviously, as you can imagine, the first 2 quarters of this year, the confidence levels were very low. As we move forward, companies are very resilient, and we start seeing some increases and some improvements, but not quite to what we would expected, or not quite to pre-pandemic levels. We are doing a lot of the consultations, so we work with HMRC, BASE, DIT. Constantly, they are asking us how our members are doing. Do they understand about trade agreements? Do they understand the new requirements? And what kind of business support they need? So I think that has been another key area for us. And what services do they need to ensure that they can capitalize on the opportunities that those trade agreements come with? So we offer the documentation services. We also enter into the chamber, the customs declaration space, but there is so much more to do. The practicalities of capitalizing on those trade agreements requires a lot more capacity building, not just on the company's education, but also in the business intermediary organizations like ourselves, because we are also relearning a lot of the stuff. So we need to be able to help our companies effectively. And I think that's where we need to work more in order to ensure that free trade agreements bring the opportunities for our companies as they are meant to be.
Brilliant, thanks, Susana. I think that's a really important point about sort of building capacity and trying to actually get people to understand what the benefits are of trade agreements. And I mean, it again speaks to Joe's point about utilisation and encouraging utilisation. So I will, last but not least, turn to you, Jasem, to share your thoughts.
Fantastic, thank you so much. First, I'd like, since I'm the last speaker, I'd like to thank Manchester Policy for organising such an important event at such a crucial time when the UK is trying to position itself as a leader, as global Britain, as a bridge, as the leading light in what we call fair and balanced trade and investment policies. So thank you so much for organizing this event. Thank you, my esteemed colleagues and presenters, for valuable information as always. And I would like also to thank my colleague, Dr. Nicola Butler, that basically she's been integral to this research, and I'm presenting on both of us, behalf of us. So the UK has claimed after Brexit its role as the sole negotiator in investment and trade agreements. This is a golden opportunity. This golden opportunity needs to be used and utilized in the right manner. To do that, we need to look at certain reforms that need to be implemented. And here the academic will rear its head, and I will be a little bit more detail-oriented on what we need to do in the procedure we talked to Maddy about it. So there are certain reforms. There are many reforms that we talked about, blogs, articles, it's all over the place. You can look at the reforms, you look at the suggestions. But there are certain issues that I will highlight. I would call them 4 or 5 pointers or 4 or 5 reforms that Joe and Susana and Chris touched on. And I think I'll begin with basically the structural clarity and the information accessibility, which is a really important point. So many governmental departments are engaged in the negotiations of trade and investment agreements. We don't know who's doing what they're doing, at what stage they are. What are they engaged in? Why are they engaged in a free trade agreement? What's the point of the free trade agreement? What do you mean by global Britain? This is a point that Chris mentioned. A point that Susana mentioned is what services should we use? We are relearning, and we should really have a structural clarity that should be driven by the government, should be driven by the UK governmental bodies in order to give us that clarity, that platform that we can use as a way to access this information, which is really, really important to us. So creating clarity in the structural framework where we negotiate, what we negotiate, and accessibility to information is very, very important. What's an FTA? Joe just mentioned. It's an extremely important question that we keep asked again and again and again in all the forums that we're engaged with. So this is the first point. The second point is the lack of impact or proper, detailed, comprehensive impact assessment studies at the beginning of the negotiation, during the negotiations, and at the end of the negotiations. There is a gaping hole when it comes to the UK government, when it comes to the initiation and the completion of these agreements. There's no real detailed impact studies. Look at the culture of the countries who are involved. Look at the politics, look at the legal framework. And what Chris said was really, really important. We are dealing with an ancient legal framework, whether it's our legal framework or the legal framework with countries that we're dealing with. India, for example, has a very complicated legal framework. We really need to understand it. Japan, all of the countries that Susana and Chris mentioned. So we have to have a clear impact assessment studies. These impact assessment studies need to have what we call a comprehensive stakeholder engagement, not only civil society and businesses, but us as academic, us as people, us as the Joe average, us the person that is basically small businesses that want to engage. The small business in Manchester need to understand and need to participate in the discussion of what we are trying to achieve from these free trade agreements on a sectorial level at least. The third point that we need to have a fit for purpose investment policy. Another point that Joe mentioned was basically that whenever we look at trade agreements, we look at trade and we forget investment. There are very contentious investment issues here. Dispute settlements. We are tilting now toward Asia, right? We're going to the CPTPP. They have a very contentious investment chapter. By the way, this is not a problem for the UK. This is a European problem as well. If you look at the European agreements negotiated in the past 30 years, there's only one agreement that really have a comprehensive, well, I'm not going to call it comprehensive because it's been criticized again and again, which is the European Energy Treaty. And I'm going to Brussels, I told Chris, next week to discuss this, because we need to build a bridge between trade and investment. They go hand in hand. This is something that we really need to understand. And this is a very contentious issue because how do you resolve investment treaties? How do you resolve investment chapters is very important. It was a disappointment in the UK-Japan agreement that they didn't talk about the investment. And I feel that was a failing, and I hope that we'll rectify it later on. Another point that we really need to talk about, I hear people will tell me, you're an academic, you're divorced from reality. And I'll call for it, why not? It's the alignment to the highest regulatory ideals. Okay, I was discussing something from with a colleague from the European Union. He told me, if you tell the United States that you need to achieve the highest regulatory aims, they will laugh you out of the room. It's true. I accept that, but we have to go for the highest regulatory point, or at least bridge between us and our partner, whether that was Europe or China or other countries that are involved in. But it's really, really important. And the final point that we really need to pay attention to is basically what we call an integrated approach to trade and investment agreements. We need to look at the priorities. The priorities that were mentioned again and again, priorities like the priorities mentioned by Chris and Joe and Susan. Well, COVID and vaccination, this is something we need to pay attention to. Without vaccination, we're not going to have trade because there is no movement. People are stuck in their homes. You've experienced that firsthand. How are we going to get into trade if we cannot really leave our houses to buy our milk and bread? It's really difficult on a personal level, on a very, very simple personal level. Second of all, it's climate and the environment. And a point that we really need to pay attention to, it's not only on a private. We live in a society nowadays that cares about environment. We're hearing all these issues that we're having on our highways, and it is a symptom of a disease, and the disease is that we're not paying a lot of attention to the climate, and we really need to do that. And I know that the ICC are doing a lot of work for that. A third thing is basically human rights. Human rights is a massive consideration that we really need, as global Britain, as the leading light, in creating a fair and balanced trade and investment ideas and concepts. We need to take that into consideration. This is upon us, as one of the most developed countries, as one of the leaders in this area, to take human rights consideration into. All of this is basically what we call reforms that we really need to look at. And that it fills my heart with joy that all of us are singing from the same hymn sheet. We're talking about the same thing: information, integrated trade policy, and all of that. And I hope that I've managed to sum it up to you in the 3 minutes that I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jasem. No, I think you sort of have summed up some of the key challenges facing the government. And I mean, one of the things that I think, just listening to all of you speak, and I think I will actually come back to Chris first, given you sort of set the scene and set out some of those key, I mean, it's quite a negative picture of what the UK is currently facing in terms of the challenges in sort of trying to be a leading light on trade, but recognizing that actually internationally and globally, trade is under so much pressure. And I wonder, I mean, Having said all that, how optimistic do you feel that the UK can actually try and sort of set out this agenda and actually sort of succeed in trying to sort of push forward its priorities internationally?
Well, I mean, I'm a great believer in the UK. I mean, I think if you're going to put money on one economy to be innovative, to reinvent itself, to kind of adapt, it's the UK. I think we're in a terrific position like that because we've always been like that. But I just think we need to be a little bit less naive.
Yeah.
Be a bit more aware of what's going on around the world and stop this parochial conversation around trade. Trade is an international activity. And also governments don't trade, businesses trade. So let's have the conversation with industry, the people who really actually do this stuff day in, day out. But I don't doubt there's opportunities out there. But we need to be cognizant that for companies on the ground, this is tough. You know, companies are going under, they're right against the wall. You know, we're trying to dig themselves out after COVID out of a hole. And we have to accept that, acknowledge it, work to it, support companies, to Susana's point, on a very practical level. I have never met a business that gets out of bed in the morning to trade because of an FTA. It's absolute nonsense. You know, companies go out and trade because there's an opportunity. Now, the bigger companies, where there's more on the bottom line, will certainly understand FTAs. But the idea that FTAs lead trade is total nonsense. You know, to get companies trading and to support them is really about nuts and bolts, practical support on the ground, the kind of stuff that Susana does. Going to visit the companies, getting that export plan in place, mapping out those markets, figuring out where the tariff opportunities are, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got to get that piece right. We're still bumbling along with the same model on export and trade support that we've had for decades, and it hasn't really delivered results when you look at the trade numbers. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, now, whenever, it hasn't really delivered an impactful result. So I think, and we're offline with our sort of peer countries. So I think there's real opportunity there. But to your point, we're in a terrifically innovative country. We have incredible expertise, but we're starting to relearn policy and how we kind of manage it all. And we've just got to be patient. We've got to manage expectations. We've got to be really focused on where we can make a difference, be pragmatic out there, stop the sort of silly rhetoric, be cognizant to our foreign relations, particularly around China. You know, we've got to be wise and clever and smart and intelligent. You know, everybody wants to trade with the UK, so let's grab the opportunity and make the most of it. You know, I would like to see a little bit of a sort of toning down in some areas so we get a sort of more balanced approach to it, get back to where we used to be in that sense.
I mean, I'm also just sort of on that, what's quite interesting is obviously your role, your involvement with the APPG on trade and export promotion. I mean, how do you find it as engaging with parliamentarians? Do you feel like parliamentarians do also understand that, and that there's that sort of understanding, or again, is there a bit of a gap that needs to maybe be bridged that might help where Parliament can also encourage that kind of conversation?
I think there's two elements to the APPG which are interesting. We've got this incredible supporter network. I mean, to Nasim's point, I mean, the consensus across businesses, industry, unions, consumers, academics, economists is, I've never seen anything like it. It is unbelievable. On the big ticket issues, we're all on the same page. If you read what consumers are saying, it's exactly the same as what industry is saying. There's terrific consensus there. So that's a real opportunity for us to build on that platform, because it hasn't always been like that. We've been at each other's throats for a long time. It's not the case now. There's a real sort of a sense of what the priorities are. I think in Parliament, if you clock up the numbers, there are about 1,100 parliamentarians. Only 10% of those have any sort of formal involvement with a sort of trade-related forum within Parliament, whether that's an APPG or a committee. So that's a tiny percentage. Then you've got new intake parliamentarians as well on top of all of that. So, you know, we've got a hill to climb to sort of educate, raise awareness. Certainly the onus is on industry to kind of walk everyone through what is trade? What does it mean every day? I think that's the kind of task ahead. But that sort of skills piece is really important. For industry, it's important. For government, it's important. For Parliament, it's important too, that we understand it so we can design the right agreements, design the right policies to really sort of be successful.
Definitely, that's really interesting. I mean, that definitely speaks to what Susana was saying as well. Joe, one of the things that we thought was really interesting about your reflections on the Manchester-India partnership was about, you know, as you say, there's now, you've helped contribute to a sort of a direction now to actually striking an FTA with India. But the point that you made, that actually just through that partnership alone, you actually did enhance trade and investment flows. And again, it goes to the point that FTAs aren't everything. And I wonder whether, just from your sort of perspective there, whether there are other sort of other areas that globally, like where the UK should be sort of targeting its focus in terms of trying to increase trade and investment, and whether there would be other countries or, I say, regions that you would be thinking, actually, that's the next place that either Manchester or other parts of the UK should be trying to build those relationships.
Yeah, sure. And, totally, agree with the summary you made there, and what Chris said, that FTAs aren't the panacea to trade and investment increases. You've got to be out there looking for the opportunities, and businesses are hungry for those opportunities, and we just need to help them. In terms of other regions of the world, I mean, we have got an FTA with Japan, but as you said, that doesn't answer everything. But Japan is definitely, a nation that we have traded with. We have a long history of trading with Japan, but there is probably more that can be done there. We've kind of left them to one side and always been looking for the next big thing. Well, we shouldn't forget about those long-standing trading partners who, again, are really keen to collaborate with us, particularly in areas like low carbon. They're really keen on green energy. And again, we have got the skills and the opportunities to look at some really interesting collaborations. So for me, and again, bringing it back to a Manchester level, we have established a Greater Manchester Japan steering group, particularly because we see that there's an opportunity now to take things to the next level. So for me, that is one to watch.
Yeah, I know that's really, really interesting. And as I say, like, it's sort of clearly a lesson to be taken maybe for other regions as well. I mean, the other thing that you talked about when you were making remarks was around the sort of role that's been played in terms of coordinating the views of businesses to actually feed into some discussions in government. I wonder, just from your experience of that, how you found that conversation with government and how that relationship is sort of managed in terms of trying to ensure that those local perspectives are actually taken into account when central government is going off and trying to either negotiate deals or formulate their sort of priorities when approaching trade negotiations or conversations around investment.
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting because obviously there is that formal mechanism for feeding in through consultations. We recently held a business summit for Manchester and India, and we had a key representative from the Department of International Trade on our panel there. And very much the message was, we're listening, but it feels like a bit of a black hole. You don't really know, well, what have you listened, and when is it coming out, and when are we going to hear the results? So I think there could be, again, with the word transparency was used before, I think there could be greater transparency around, well, what was fed in, where's the summaries, what are the recommendations? It feels like we're just going to go straight into negotiations without actually sharing back with wider stakeholders about what they heard, to actually validate that they got the messages right to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I mean, I think, again, one of the things you said was around sort of encouraging people to actually take advantage of trade deals. And if the government isn't necessarily negotiating what is sort of actually reflecting the needs of businesses and what businesses would want and what they desire, then actually the opportunity for business to actually make the most of them is going to be reduced. Correct. It's sort of really important to have that dialogue. I'll come to you, Susana. So I had a few questions for each of you, and I promise I will open up to the floor. But one of the things that I was quite interested in what you were saying was, you obviously have been having quite a dialogue with government around what businesses do need. I wonder if you can just share a bit more about what those priorities actually are from the conversations you've been having with members.
I think I just have to piggyback on what Joe just said, that we've done a lot of those consultations, and when we are having those, oh yes, that's fantastic feedback, where it makes sense, but then you don't feel like those are actually being integrated into what they are going to negotiate. So, and I think if the communication bit is very important, and I think as much as we had some successes, for example, with HMRC, with consultations with HMRC, actually, we thought, actually they are listening, because the next thing you know, they were kind of putting together the business support that we were asking them. That was the feedback that we were getting from businesses. But then it's also what Chris said, is understanding who's doing what and all these Brexit or new rules trading, because sometimes you were talking to HMRC and they said, oh no, that's not us, that's actually the IT, and you think, why? Okay. So you go to the IT, no, that's HMRC or base, and you're like, okay. Even for us as a business support organizations, and we are ahead of many businesses on this area, is confusing. So I think that's one of the main things, and making sure that I talk about capacity building, and I think it's about making sure that we complement each other. Sometimes it feels like it's overlapping, and that's waste of resources, money, time, etc., and not to mention confusing the businesses that actually are the ones that need the support. So for me, it's like communication will be a very important thing. And just to my last point will be, businesses are resilient. So with or without an FTA, they will trade. That's just been around for hundreds of millions of years. So they will continue, but FTAs are there to aid, to make it easier. And if companies don't understand, how can they even tap into opportunities? And for us as a chamber, we also be making sure that we are expanding our connections overseas to make sure that people understand the opportunities that are arising, and to get the practical advice on the ground on how to actually tap into those opportunities. And I think that's where we need to see how we can maximize what the government resources are, what the private sector, and ourselves.
I think that's a really interesting point about exactly having complementary sort of skills and input rather than, as you say, duplicating it. And one sort of I think other question I just have is you mentioned about the fact that businesses, they're resilient, they will trade. I mean, as we discussed, Global Britain has become quite a key slogan, and the idea of encouraging trade is clearly something this government really wants to do. Do you feel like that has translated on the ground? Do you think those SMEs are saying, well, we know that this is the sort of the current mood of the government, and we want to try and do that more? Or do you think there is still a bit of a gap there?
I think I've been in the UK for 20 years, and I can clearly say that 20 years ago, when companies were encouraged to do trading with emerging markets, not that interested. Since all this happened, I think there has been a genuine more interest in pursuing new opportunities, and I think that's where we need to kind of grasp the opportunity. So yes, there is a genuine interest in going beyond the EU, but let's not forget that the EU continues to be one of our most important trading partners. So we need to also kind of maintain good relationships with them, especially on the new trade agreement.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Chris, you wanted to?
Yeah, just what I can share is a bit of insight from our global network. So we're in 100 countries and talk to businesses on the ground all over the world, and they look at us saying Global Britain and just look confused, scratching their heads and say, what are you talking about? It makes no sense whatsoever. So it's not that the concept of Global Britain is a bad thing. I think we've always been outward facing. I think it sort of chimes with what we've always been, but we do need to define it in the new world we live in today. Otherwise, it does look a bit like Commonwealth Mark II. We've got to be a bit smarter around that. I think it's really important. The point around cross-government coordination is also an interesting one, because I think we all struggle. I do worry about businesses. I mean, we kind of know how to navigate it, but we also find it challenging. But if you're a business, how on earth do you know who to pick up the phone to solve your problem? It's really difficult, because we have a government at the moment. I'd like to see Cabinet Office playing a stronger role here. Its function is cross-government coordination. But at the moment, we've got these fragmented pockets, and some brilliant work going on, by the way. But it's only as good as the sum of its parts, right? So we need that sort of stronger central coordination, I think, within the government. That would all.
I bet you, because it took me a while to understand it. So, and as I said, I get paid a lot of money just to sit down and read stuff. So I really will advocate, myself and Nicola, we advocate that we really need to have a clarity of information, clarity of purpose, a clarity of the process, and a clarity of engagement, and in emphasizing the role of the Cabinet Office, and send newsletters every month to us. Because I also agree on the point of consensus. When I engage with people, when I'm talking to business people or civil society, we have a rare opportunity, and that's why I called it a golden opportunity, because there is consensus. Yeah. We need to take advantage of this consensus and push forward, because if we don't, we will be left behind. And I agree with Susana, we really also need to stay engaged with the European market, because it is our stronger, bigger markets, and we need to keep engaging with it. That's it.
No, that's helpful. And I think, yeah, as you sort of summed up exactly that point about having a clarity of engagement, but also communication being really, really important. Right, I said I would open up to the floor, so I will. And I think there is a roving microphone. Yeah. I'll take the gentleman in the glasses and then come forward. Actually, both got glasses. Sorry, that didn't work. In the suit with glasses. Sorry, the man with the red tie. There we go. That was very well done on my part.
Hello, my name's David. I'm from the Law Society. I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm an expert in digital market access. We deal with 3 government departments at the moment on formal agreements, and we are slightly embarrassed by the legal services, a great global Britain name. But actually, the legal sector is a global giant, and still, after Brexit. And they are global giant because they exploit opportunities, sometimes very small, sometimes very narrow, understanding the jurisdictions that they're working with. So the broader question is, sort of the political imperative to find big set-piece trade deals getting in the way of just riding through the detail, jurisdiction, country by country by country? Should that be our priority rather than the replacement of the EU with some other grand trade agreement?
I think it's a really interesting question. Does anyone want to immediately jump in?
Yeah, I mean, we work a lot with the legal sector, so totally get that. Look, I think, FTAs are not the only tool in the box. I think there was a point just made earlier, which is a really good one, is there are lots of different ways of having the conversation around trade. One of the most successful trade relationships is London, New York. That's nothing to do with government, and it's nothing to do with any FTA. It's just 2 cities being very effective in breaking down market access barriers for the financial services. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. In terms of the legal services, a really interesting point, because trade in services globally is extremely undeveloped. We talked a lot about investment, but trade in services is nothing like trading goods. We've focused a lot on trading goods in terms of the sort of dialogues around trade. Tariffs these days are not the big part of trade.
Yeah.
It's market access barriers, it's non-tariff barriers, particularly in services. So I think, but to do it, we need, we talked about strategy. We need to have a very clear sense of strategy as to what are we trying to achieve as a huge services economy in the world, because that conversation is ripe to be had. The UK is in the pole position, from my perspective, to drive that conversation, because it's not going to come out of the US and it's not going to come out of the EU. This is where the big power blocks will find it difficult. You need a nimble player partnering up probably with Japan and drive that conversation into the global community. How do we bring down those barriers for the services community? And the legal community should be right in the heart of that conversation. Now, City UK published a report recently, which is, I think, a big step forward, because we haven't had an industry view on trade and services. So that's the starting point. But I think the next staging post is to sit down with government as industry and say, okay, what are we shooting for here? How do we get this both at multilateral level and at bilateral FTA level? Because the opportunity is right there in front of us, and we've got a big stake in the game.
Yes, absolutely. I'll just, Joe, please. And
Yeah.
No. Basically, someone described to me that trade and services as the neglected sibling. No one talks about it, which is really an apt description of it. And I totally agree with Chris. It's basically the non-trade barriers that are going to be the problem, especially with the United States. It's going to be a massive issue. This is the stumbling block. People, they talk about goods. No. Trade and services is going to be the big issue, whether it's financial services or legal services or any form of services. And as a country, the UK shifted its economy towards services a long time ago. And this should be our priority, really, in any negotiations. But again, it is the neglected sibling. It's a neglected brother or sister that no one talks about it, because it's complicated. And because it's complicated, they leave it. They talk about the easy stuff. That is the truth. Because if you really want to dig into the legal services, and I speak here as a lawyer, it is complicated. And the NTPs are genuinely going to be the most problematic stumbling block in our negotiations with the United States. And I think the minister said yesterday it's going to be 10 years. It's going to be more than that. It's going to be more than that, and let's be honest about it. But the other point I want to take is that approaching it from a sectorial point of view, look sector by sector and doing this. Here's the pros and cons, whether we should do that or not depends on how much leverage do we want and how do we approach it. In the European Union, they do that a little bit, but I still that we need to put it in the context of multilateral agreements, because bilateral agreements, I think, might be the easy way, but on the long run, they might not bear the fruits that we want them, especially when it comes to trade and services. Sorry, John.
No, it's fine. I mean, yeah, I think you've said everything there that, you know, I would agree with as well. I mean, coming from Deloitte, you know, services is our business. And, you know, with my Deloitte hat on now, feeding into the consultation on the India FTA, it was all around, well, how can we make this work for our business? And the big challenge that comes through actually is about the mutual recognition of qualifications. Yeah. That is the biggest challenge and the biggest hurdle that comes through. And, you know, but we can't ignore it. We can't just put it in the it's too difficult box. Yeah. We have got to seriously think about how we're going to make it work.
Yeah.
The India one is a really interesting one because you wait when it starts because we want access to the services market in India. That's the big play for us. Yeah. But the big play in reverse is access to the labour market. Yeah. And we've got this very kind of complicated immigration type scene here. So, you know, that's always been the Indian play. There's nothing new about that. It's the big red flag, but wait till it happens. And this, you know, to the point around the need for inclusivity, dialogue, we've got to have the conversation because it's coming and trade is a give and take. We don't tell India what to do and they don't tell us what to do. We've got to sit around the table and say, okay, you give us this and we'll give you that. Yeah. But it won't work if we don't have a public dialogue. Yeah. Around, in our case, it's going to be immigration, and for them, it's going to be about, are we going to prepare to let British firms into the services market? It's going to be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point. I think that the question about whether or not we are in a position to make the trade-offs necessary in trade negotiations, I mean, this is where, again, the Cabinet Office comes in, because you're going to have different government departments have very different priorities. And again, we've sort of seen that a little bit on some of the messaging around the US of different lines from different ministers, depending on what sort of sectoral interest they represent. Sorry, we'll let you, so other man with the glasses. And I might take the other gentleman behind him after that as well, so we'll get both questions at once.
Thank you. And the other guy with the left. My name is Camilo Gamba. I am a former Colombian public servant, and it's really fascinating how there are some common challenges no matter the country we are talking about. So it's quite interesting. I have two questions regarding knowledge management. I think that there's a big opportunity in terms of knowledge management here. So my first question is about what's the policy on knowledge management from the Chambers of Commerce? And the second one is, how are you working in partnership with other chambers of commerce to avoid efforts duplication?
That's really interesting. So then we'll take the other gentleman behind, two rows behind, and then open that out.
Thanks. Eric Quirk, professional in Manchester. You've all been incredibly positive. The result of some of the questions is perhaps split seams a little bit. One person mentioned human rights. When we're negotiating a big deal, are we going to force our view of human rights in that? Well, I suppose it depends how big the other country is. Nobody mentioned foreign languages. No government in the last 20 years has made any serious effort to prevent the collapse of foreign language teaching in schools. It is disgusting. It went down 5% last year, I think. It's always about STEM, very important, or music maybe. How many people in this room, you know, can speak Hindi, Mandarin, or Japanese?
It's a really interesting remark, and I think, you know, that again, we talked about sort of capability in terms of trade understanding, but obviously there are also a broader set of skills that will inform our engagement internationally. So I think that's a really interesting remark. I might come to you, Susana, on the question of sort of how the chambers work with each other and how you sort of share and collaborate on.
Yeah, so we do have a large network. So as a British Chamber of Commerce, we have bilateral chambers of commerce in a huge number of countries. But us as a chamber, what we thought is, you know, it's important to have those relationships. And the way we've been working with those chambers have been primarily on promoting the business opportunities and then connecting our members to that practical advice on the ground on how to capitalize on that. It's not always been easy because I go back to my point of the capacity building. So we have some partners overseas which are really capable of supporting those businesses, whilst others not so much. So we have to go beyond the Chamber of Commerce network, and we actually work also with other regional chambers. Last year we worked with the Portuguese Chamber of Commerce, with a smaller Chamber of Commerce in Spain, and you know, it's been our goal that it doesn't matter where the information, the advice comes from, as long as it's the right thing for the business, whether that's an exporting advice, importing advice, or actually investing advice. And that's how we've been working. And some of them have been incredibly helpful when, we have companies with goods stock in Turkey or Poland. And then it has been because we don't get the feedback from the customs. And we have been able to help and support our businesses through those connections. And then on the point on languages, which obviously touches me directly, being originally from Colombia. And it's something that I find that it's sad to see that it's not being as an urgent priority, because I think we've been very reliant that when we go outside to do business, people will speak in English and will kind of, that's a given. But nothing tells us more that when we're building long-term relationships, and if we're talking about a global Britain, which might be confusing to some, that we also need to come from a different approach. We want to trade with them, but we also need them to trade with us. It's that bilateral trade and investment kind of linkage. And I think languages, cultural understanding is something that is lagging behind and is not on a priority, unfortunately. We will always encourage it. We will always try to make sure that through the activities that we do, that people understand how important that is. But I think that should come from school systems, the education, the universities, how that, is being instilled on the people that are coming and be part of the talent for international trade in coming years.
If I can just add a little bit about the languages and diversity, I just want to, I totally get your point, but we shouldn't be really down on our luck in this country. Look at this panel, look at the diversity on this panel. Look, we are, I was not born in this country, but I am influencing the discussion, and then I hope. And same with Chris, same with Susana, same with Joe. So basically, we are a diverse country. We need to take advantage of the diversity. We're a multicultural country in certain aspects, so we really need to take that. The issue is to tap that potential. And use it properly. Because I again come back to the point. I agree with it. We are an innovative country. We have a lot of potential, and I think engaging with the diversity that this country has, which is, by the way, we are miles ahead of other European countries, and I have to say this. So we really need to be cheerful about it a little bit, because we need to put a positive spin. Someone told me never miss an opportunity to take advantage of a crisis, and this is a crisis, and we need to take advantage of it. So, in a nutshell, that's it. That's
interesting. Thank you, Jasem. Chris, you
just very quickly, I think you've got two chambers of commerce here right now. You've got local chamber of commerce, Greater Manchester, international chamber of commerce. We're all part of the same football team. I think that's an important point to make. We just have different positions, different roles. Our job is the international trade policy environment. GMCC is about practical support, trade support, investment support. So I think that's important. But the Chambers of Commerce network is unbelievable. Every single national capital, major trading city has a Chamber of Commerce. That's what they were set up to do. But we do need to invest in that network, in that capability. So I think there's a really interesting point to be had around the government, that we've come from an environment where government is really heavily subsidizing B2B trade support services. Is that the right model when government has taken on this expanded role of trade policy, negotiations, and everything else? I would argue that we should move to a sort of Japanese model where government is really focused on the G2G, G2B, and then the private sector is doing B2B, B2G. You watch the Japanese take supply chains into places like India, it's on a whole different level. It's because the private sector and government are working really tight together with the right financing support. It's very impressive. And I think language is spot on. I mean, I think we've just launched Latin, haven't we? What on earth that's all about, I do not know. But, it just came up in conversation in the team actually this week that if we talk skills, it's got to start primary school. I'm sorry to say that we're living in a global environment. We are a very diverse country. That's true. That's a real asset. We do have this tentacles all over the world with people who come through British universities and everything else. But we can't be complacent. The world's moved on. We've got to be able to talk and converse with the world. And we can't do that if we just talk English. So we've got to start with languages.
Schools who teach foreign languages.
Yeah, totally agree.
No, interesting. Well, I know we are coming to the end of time, but there are a couple more questions. Okay, we will take these last two contributions, and then I'll come down the panel for a final word, if that's okay. We run over a few minutes. No one has to dash off. Okay, great.
Thank you very much. I'm Umar Faruqi. I'm a spokesperson of the National Party in India. I'm a lawyer in the Indian jurisdiction, and I've moved to the UK to qualify as a barrister. I would echo, and I would like to thank all the panelists for such an insightful event, discussions. At the same time, I would like to ask about zero carbon policy, especially for a country like India, where pollution is a major problem. UK, especially as we are all in Manchester, Manchester City, which is leading the carbon zero policy at the moment, implementation. How can UK lead and direct the world, especially with the new FTAs and new policies that we all are seeing?
Brilliant, thank you. And I think there's one more question, and then I'll start with Joe and go that way. So just to give you a heads up, I'm going to you first.
Deepesh Patel, editor at Trade Finance Global. I have a question to the panel about access to trade finance. FTI and access to finance was mentioned quite a lot. Obviously, we're now at a point where the banks have retracted from lending quite significantly to MSMEs, aided by the government's fiscal support in the last 18 months. It's clear they're going to pull back from that very soon, and also with respect to trade credit insurance and government backing there. So what's the panel's view on what next? How can UK government work with I guess, those public-private partnerships? We've also seen some recent things come to light with UK Export Finance not providing as much support as it's what can we do there?
Really interesting question. Okay, great. So Joe,
I'll got some comments on both of those.
Yes, no, please do. No, take both. Both of you.
Well, I'll start there and pass down. So Umar, thank you for the question there. You're right. Manchester is leading the way in many ways. It's got a net zero target by 2038 to be carbon neutral. And I think, I'll go back to what I said in my opening words, that I think sometimes city to city actual actions and collaborations can have the impact we need in a quicker fashion and then perhaps national initiatives. So I think that's my first point, that I would encourage all regions of the UK to be looking at, well, what can we do with our partners around the world and our connections to work on these targets? We've got COP26 coming up very soon, and that's obviously going to be a major platform for national conversations, but equally, those local conversations as well. So I think we really need to, it is on the agenda. I know from the Manchester India Partnership, it's a clear item on the agenda there. It is with our work with Japan. In fact, we are about to launch some work with Osaka, Manchester and Osaka, all focused on clean energy. So actually, there is a lot that's happening, but of course there is so much more we can do. I think with a lot of countries there is an issue around financing, because I think what we sometimes forget is that the West benefited for decades from burning coal and from making lots of money from that, and other countries have been catching up, and we can't be ignorant to the fact that they've not had that economic benefit that we have benefited from. So I think we need to see how we can support in the best possible way for the benefit of everyone. Coming to the other point, I mean, you mentioned public-private partnerships on your question there, and I have always been a strong advocate of public and private sector working together. It's the best way that you can make things happen, and I really liked your comment, Chris, about the Japan example, that actually, you do have to come together to work on so many of these areas, because we all need to recognise that we all have different skill sets, we all have different routes to make things happen, and we need to embrace that and just see how we can make those connections stronger.
Yeah, thanks, Joe.
Yes, I'll just echo exactly what was said. Basically, I think, as I said, we need to have an integrated approach to our trade and investment treaties, and that should be done on a national level. That should be encouraged, because other considerations should be taken into place when you negotiate these things. But again, the point that Joe and Chris said, which is basically city to city, sub-national level, I think works very well. I think we need to have baby steps, especially with contentious issues like the environment with India, because Joe's point is extremely important, that we did benefit here in the West from, let's call it a grace period, and it's tough for us to go and lecture people on what they need to do in order to improve their economy. So we need to be very careful in the way we approach these things, and maybe the sectorial approach, maybe the sub-national approach is the way to go forward. That's my opinion. As for the public-private partnership, I totally agree with that, especially if you want to make a success of this upcoming UK export strategy and the trade invoice. But I would like also to, the professional member bodies, farmers, fisheries, all of these people, they really need to have their voice heard. And if I'm honest with you, they really need to say what they want, and they need to be clear about it. Because as we said at the beginning, there is consensus. It's a golden opportunity. This is the third time I repeat it. And they really need to engage. And these professional membership bodies, in many sectors, again, it's the same approach. Instead of having it as a national, I would say sector by sector will work a little bit better in order to improve the chances of this partnership and the finances of what initiatives that we're calling for.
Susana, any final thoughts from you?
I'm just gonna kind of touch on the net zero. I think is again there is a lot of going on from the international and then local, and for us from a chamber point of view, then it's more about encouraging the companies to look into those opportunities, the expertise that we have, how we share that knowledge, and how we create those collaborations, as Joe said, maybe city to city or country to country. There is different ways in which we can kind of share that and create some commercial opportunities on the back. In terms of the grants, I think I will go on the point that Chris made, is maybe that we need to look into a different kind of subsidized model where companies, yes, I think we still need some support for companies. As I said, there is a huge lack of understanding and education. If we're asking people to feed into FTAs agreements, into consultation, they need to understand what they're feeding into, the basics. If they don't understand rules of origin, well, if they are doing goods or if they're doing services and there is not understanding how that's affecting them, they're not gonna do any feedback whatsoever. So there is a huge element of that. Capacity building should be at the center of any support going forward. And then I would argue as well that we need to move from the huge amount of support that is going into that the government is taking on their stride to do, what they could be liaising more effectively and capitalizing on the private sector. So
yeah, it's really interesting.
Just a couple of points on the India point. I mean, I think COP is going to be really difficult, by the way. We're just in a very difficult environment where global agreements are tough. But part of the solution here is to find this 100 billion climate finance. That's the big ask from the developing countries. India is a big part of that equation. So I love the fact that the small island economies are now speaking up and saying we need COP, we want a solution. That's a great sign because that voice hasn't always been heard necessarily. But climate finance, guess where one of the biggest solutions is? London. We are a leader in that field. We have this huge financial capital right on our doorstep. So I think where I would really like, and I hope the UK can find a solution, is around that climate finance. The money is there, it's just in the wrong place. We need to incentivize it into the right place, and then that will help countries like India make the transition. In terms of the trade finance issue, let's just put a myth to bed. Export finance is not trade finance. Export finance is a tiny, tiny part of the bigger trade finance picture. The trade finance gap globally is 3 to 5 trillion. It's more than doubled during COVID, and a lot of that sits in the emerging markets. It's 2 billion in the UK, and it's the short-term working capital that trading companies need to fund those deals. It's really important segment of the finance market, but the market is broken, and we've got to fix it. So we have a new electronic trade documents bill coming into Parliament next year. That will solve half the problem. That's a terrific piece of work from the government. But the other half of the problem, we need to tackle bureaucracy and banks because they're dealing with all this paperwork. We've got to find a smarter, more intelligent solution to that. That's sort of a quarter of the problem. And then we've got to fix the Basel III framework, which came in after the financial crisis, really to stabilize the capital markets. That was the #1 priority. But in doing that so quickly, trade finance got bundled in with all sorts of different sorts of finance, high-risk finance. Trade finance is a zero to low risk activity in the bank, but it's treated in the same way as high-risk finance. So there's a real argument to be made to the Basel III framework, regulators, that we need to decouple the two and put a more proportionate regulatory regime around trade finance, and then that would free up more capital into the market. So the solutions are there, but we need to have those conversations with government, with Treasury, and the wider global community. We can solve that problem. And again, the UK can lead. In fact, we are leading the conversation, actually. I don't know anywhere in our network globally that are having the conversation like we are with the Treasury and the banking and finance industry. Massive opportunities for everybody there.
Brilliant, thanks. That was a quite positive note to end on, I think. Clearly some big problems ahead, but the UK is well placed to try and navigate them and lead on that. So I just want to say thank you very much to the panel for a really insightful discussion. Thank you very much all of you for attending, and to Policy at Manchester for organising it. Sorry we ran over. I know that's a sort of complete, shouldn't do that at a Fringe event, but I appreciate you all attending. So have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.